Hey gang, and welcome to the latest edition of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. This time around, we're focusing on creepy cryptid encounters. As always, if you have a scary story you would like to hear narrated, please send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I'd also like to thank everyone for hanging out at our first virtual campfire last night, for all those who just listened, and for all of those who shared their stories. I had a blast, I hope you did too, and we're going to do it again very, very soon. So, before we get to that point though, everybody sit back, relax, let's hear some true creepy cryptid encounters. Let's get it on. Mothman by Scarlett. My family and I moved into a new house on a hill in a little back road in a very small town of Fort Gay, West Virginia. Fort Gay sits right on the east side of Kentucky, and the population of my town then was probably just a couple thousand. My family and I were unpacking, and we had not yet put the furniture in its right place when everything was still in boxes. Overwhelmed with working all day, I retired around 11 p.m., and I put my little brother on the couch and I took his bed since my bed wasn't being put together yet. His room faced the front of the house, and his window was around 20 or 25 feet or so off the ground. I was looking out the window when I saw it. It stood about 7 feet tall, and I had no idea what it was, but it froze me in my tracks. I had never been that scared in all my life. All I could do was lay there and just stare at this thing. It was sitting in a tree about 50 or so feet off the ground, and about 50 feet from the house across the yard. It felt like an eternity, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even blink. It had big, red, bright glowing eyes looking dead into my face, and I finally worked up enough courage to close my eyes and put my head under the covers, when all of a sudden this thing smacked the window. I went through the house screaming, There's something outside! I was crying, and my mom and dad looked at me and said, What's wrong with you? Looks like you've seen a ghost. My face was snow white, and I said, I don't know what it was, but please, Daddy, don't go outside. I begged and begged, and he came back in and said that there was nothing out there, and I kept screaming, saying, Yes, there is! Yes, there is! When I explained to them what I had saw and how I felt, they thought I was crazy, but to this day I will not go outside by myself, and even in the day someone has to sit with me when I go out to my car. I've heard of some pretty crazy things going on farther up that road, but I never expected to experience anything myself. Much later, my husband and I went to the theater and watched the Mothman prophecies. I was reliving that night over and over again, and the way they described feeling and what you saw was remarkable. My husband looked over me and said, Isn't that what you described to me when we first started dating? I couldn't say a word. At that moment, I knew what it was that I had saw. I believe in my heart of hearts I saw the Mothman. It's just a little weird. I only live about 80 miles south of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where all that stuff took place 37 years ago. And it was exactly 32 years to the month when I first saw it. Griffith Park Creature by Lerpa. This event took place in October of 2005. It didn't happen to me personally, but to 3 very close and trustworthy friends who still get frightened to even talk about it. I'm writing about it in hopes that perhaps someone saw the same thing or something similar. All of us went to the bars that night. I left for home and my cousin Nicole went to bed. The 3 remaining guys, Carl, Reggie, and my cousin's boyfriend Brian, decided to smoke a cigarette out on the balcony. They sat out there for a while talking and smoking, and around 3 a.m. they heard what sounded like a horse coming down the street. From where the balcony is, you can only see so far up the street, and the noise seemed to be coming from up the hills and towards the north. All the guys joked about what it could be. There is a horse riding facility in Griffith Park, so they assumed perhaps a horse was loose. It sounded as if it was galloping and coming closer, and finally it was close enough, and they knew as soon as it rounded the corner they would see what it was. To this day, All three shake when describing it to me. According to them, it was a humanoid of some sort. Its legs were very long as well as its feet, and it was taking huge strides as it made its way down the street. Its back was bent, and its neck was very long and bent forward, and they said no human could be bent like this thing was. Its eyes were black, but it did have the whites as well, and its skin was this transparent green, and it was wearing nothing but white pants and black shoes. Carl said it looked like a dead Ziggy Stardust because the hair was bright red. As soon as they saw it, Reggie let out a tiny gasp, and the thing instinctively looked at them and squinted. They said that it was so dark they couldn't imagine that a human could have heard that tiny gasp and then immediately locate the sound. This thing did, however. It never stopped moving, and once it was past the driveway and viewpoint of the men, the clomping noise abruptly stopped. Reggie feared that perhaps it had scaled the apartment building and was now on the roof. I asked all three of them to draw it for me in separate rooms, and their drawings were all eerily similar. Carl thinks it's a ghost from the 70s that perhaps was killed in the park, and Brian is convinced it was a creature, and Reggie said that in the Philippines they would have called it a specter. They said they all sensed it was hunting something and that it wanted no part of them, but they all agreed that it was after something. They also said that they felt like they were not supposed to have seen it. I've been all over the internet trying to find if anyone has heard of something similar. All of them said they weren't sure how this creature or ghost or whatever it was could have made such a loud horse clomping sound. None of them could agree on its feet. Brian didn't remember what they looked like, nor did Reggie, but Carl said they were black boots. Is it possible they were hooves? Carl is one of the toughest and largest men I know. At 6'3" and 300 pounds, he isn't the type to be easily frightened. I was surprised when I asked him, "Do you think if it had wanted to, it could have hurt you?" And he just said, "That thing could have fucked us all up." A Monster in Georgia by Anonymous. This occurred in an area that is flanked to the north by a swamp marsh waterway, and to the north as well there are farmlands with cattle. Just southwest there are a series of creeks and waterways that lead into the woodlines behind a couple of small farms, one of which has horses on it. This incident took place in the woods just behind and around my home. The land has a natural series of creek beds, and it grows very thick in the summer. It's also heavily wooded with many low areas at the back of the 4 acres that I live on. 1 acre is fenced in and clear cut, the rest is natural growth. The area, although being developed for housing, is still seated in a lot of heavy wooded terrain. I have lived on this land for a decade, and I've always kept dogs in a fenced-in yard that borders the wooded area of the property. At just after 1:30 in the morning one night, I woke up to my dogs barking in a very aggressive manner. I got out of bed to go and shut them up, thinking that it was just likely a dog or a deer that was wandering through the woods at night. It was nearly a full moon, and I should add here that in my 10 years that I've lived there, I have never seen a human in the woods behind my house. I stepped out onto the back porch in my underwear and yelled at the dogs. And this is where it got very different from all the countless times I'd quieted them in the past. I yelled out, "All right, y'all chill out! People are sleeping!" And before I finished the sentence, I heard footsteps, not of a 4-legged variety, but one very methodically going after the other. This got my full attention. I have a storage building at the back corner of my yard, and my first thought was that somebody must be trying to break into it. It sits on the very back corner of the fence and could be accessed by hopping over a 4-foot chain link fence. I went back inside to grab a flashlight and my 9mm pistol, but as I went back inside, I heard a sort of shriek coming from outside. It was very loud and actually made me jump a bit. I was thinking it was likely teenagers at this point, likely shouting some sort of insult, but there was something unnerving about the way it carried into my house. I told my girlfriend, who was starting to wake up, that there was somebody walking in the woods making weird noises, and that she needed to come hear it for herself, and I was going to chase him off. I ran back out onto the porch and shouted, "Whoever you are, I'm going to let these dogs out, so you better speak and be on your way." No response came back, but the footfalls were obviously close to the fence line and were heavy sounding. I went over to the gate, and the dogs would not leave the yard or my side. This was the first time that I had ever witnessed them refuse a chance to run into the woods, and at this point, I was a bit angry and embarrassed that I had made a threat to the intruder, and that my dogs just sat there. This was when my whole world was tilted on its ear. I shouted, "I'm about to come out there and find you, and when I do, I'm going to shoot you," figuring this would make whoever it was haul their ass out of there. As I yelled this thing went from one end of my yard, around the corner of the fence, to up near the front of my yard in less than 15 seconds, with a very distinct two-legged sound, loud and heavy. In broad daylight, I could not duplicate this speed in twice the time. There are obstacles everywhere that you will bust your butt on out there. I had no intention of going into the woods in my underwear and barefoot, so I chambered around and fired a couple of shots into the ground, with the fourth being a misfire that I quickly cleared. At that moment, something started shrieking and howling at extremely high decibels and was coming closer. It wasn't running away, but running towards the side of the front of my house where I was standing. My girlfriend was up on the side porch and asking, "What the hell is that?" And then, even though I was between her and the woods, she said she was going back inside. Normally, when an animal is in the woods, I can trick it into looking into a flashlight by making a high-pitched noise or whistle, thereby giving me a look at its position. This time, the thing never revealed its eyes to me, and I found that to be very unusual. I have to add here that I was physically shaking at how much noise this thing made and how heavy it sounded as it kept howling and wailing and screaming and moving around in the tree line just beside my fence. I'm 6'4", 290, and I'm not fat. My friends often joke that I'm a shaved Sasquatch. I'm 41 years old and have worked as a bouncer and babysitter in bars from the nicest type, all the way down to the nudie bar hellholes. I am not an easy man to intimidate. Whatever was moving out there was much bigger than me, as well as much faster. I moved up onto the side porch to be ready to flee from whatever the hell it was, and I would be lying if I said otherwise here. I was badly shaken by this thing. Being unable to see it while it was so close was chilling my blood. When I got to the porch and up the stairs, both porches are about 5 feet above the ground, this thing moved back into the woods, like a couple of 100 feet. How do I know this? I heard it as it went, one step after another. And me and my girlfriend, who was standing just inside the side porch door, heard what seemed to be heavy timber being smacked or knocked together. It came in a succession of 3 whumps each time, which really unnerved me as I had just fired 3 rounds. Coincident or not, it was like it was letting me know it was aware of what I just did and was replicating the 3 knock slams each time, and then would pause a few seconds before doing it again. It stopped doing this and I shouted out again, this time saying something to the effect of, "Who are you?" And then I heard it moving back this way again. It moved so fast that it actually defied anything logical. The very heavy and rhythmic sound of one foot after another was so audible. I was only shouting at this point because in the back of my mind I wanted to hear a human voice or laughter from kids, anything but another god-awful howl. I was hoping for a known explanation or a reason for the sounds to be as loud as they were, like maybe a recording played through a bullhorn or something. But I knew that this was something very different. My mind was refusing to believe that this was real, yet there I was, hearing it for myself. At this point, my girlfriend was pleading for me to come back inside so she could lock the doors. I went inside and put on some pants and shoes, dug out a video camera, and turned off all the lights on the back part of the house. I wish I had taken it out the first time, but I believed that it was a prowler or vandal at first, so there was no reason to take a camera. The gun and flashlight are my 2 best bets in that case. But I truly regret not having it with me when this thing started making those sounds. I crept down the stairs to the yard in the darkness, and I sat there for a while, and then decided to move over toward the fence line by the side porch. Just then, from the woods, there came those damned footfalls again. I was in the dark, and I had a flashlight too, but I didn't want to reveal my position. This thing was shadowing my movements from the left to the right of the yard, staying in equal distance outside the fence. I did this for over an hour, with it moving every single time I did. I would remain stationary for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and at one point I thought I heard my dogs down in my storage shed. I figured they went in there to bed down, and I walked back to my stairs to go inside, and my blood ran cold when I realized that both dogs were cowering in my living room. I had not pulled the door closed behind me when I went inside, and they had to be physically removed from the house to the back porch. That has also never happened with them before. At this point, I actually went into my workroom and grabbed a thick piece of wood and cut it to bar the back door from sliding open. In the decade I've lived out here, I've never had a lock on my back door, due to the fact that there were always dogs in the yard who hate everything that is not me or my family. Nobody goes in the backyard. I thought about calling the sheriff's department at this point, but what could I tell them? I'm afraid a Bigfoot is pissed at me and it's after me? Yeah, I don't think so. That just sounds way too damn crazy. That all happened the first night. The next day, I was mad that I was so afraid the night before. I had 2 rechargeable spotlights, but neither one was working that night. The bulbs or batteries were bad. Who knows? I went to Home Depot and bought a 2.25 million candle power spotlight and took it home. I've hunted all my life, so I thought I would rig up some light along my fence line near the shed. And if this thing came back, I could flip a switch and turn night into day, and maybe get a look at it as it fled the light and went to the same dark corner of my lot. At that point, I figured I could light it up with the 2.25 million candle power light. My girlfriend walked to the shed with me, and I went to the fence to position the light. As I got to the fence, I was talking to her saying, if I put it here, it should run back to the other side. And there it was. I saw it with my own eyes, between 2 trees and some brush. There was a 3 by 3 foot section of long brown fur, clearly visible and moving slightly. I yelled, "There it is!" And although my girlfriend thought I was kidding, she saw the bushes as they were being parted as something moved rapidly into the more dense growth. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a dog. It was too massive. I saw the rounded back of the animal as it sort of duck-walked away towards a creek bed, and it was gone in a matter of seconds, and I was not going to chase it. We were standing there in total disbelief. The damn thing was still here the next day in broad daylight. It just seemed too surreal to believe. Was it waiting for me? We waited for a while and never heard anything move. It was in there and it was trying to hide. We walked around to the front part of the shed, and that's when we noticed 2 odd things. One was that there was black water bubbling up from the ground, and it had a very strong smell to it. This is on the other side of the yard from where my septic lines should be, as well as uphill from them. I was wondering if the smell maybe drew this thing in close to my home. Secondly was the spookiest of all. There was a footprint in my yard that measured 15 inches in length, right by my fence, where it seemed like this thing stepped over it into the woods. This was in the soggy part near the black water, and I tried to replicate it myself with my size 14s, but the difference was still huge. It seemed to have a rounded heel and toes, and I don't know if the plaster will set there due to this new mystery spring that has crept up, but I covered it with a paint roller tray to protect it from the dogs walking on it anyway. I didn't figure how it could be anybody but me in this yard, and once again, I couldn't duplicate it. I hope there was an explanation for this other than a friggin' Sasquatch in my yard. There's also a broken branch in my yard at the 10 to 12 foot height on a fresh limb that we just noticed. The thought of it coming over the fence into my safe zone is a little more than I want to believe right now. I went exploring the woods today with a friend who told me that he has read sometimes sticks or big limbs will be stacked in a triangle or pyramid fashion when Bigfoot are around. We found at least 7 such things back in that area along and around the creek bed, some of which were from a species of tree that is nowhere near my neighborhood. These structures don't seem to be anything that would naturally happen if a tree or other branches just fell. I don't know if these are significant or not, but I also found a 5-inch diameter tree that was knocked down with all the roots intact and not enough vegetation on it to account for the wind having done it. This was just on the other side of my fence, right behind my shed. I know something's out there, and I'm going to be vigilant and hope it comes back, but at the same time, I am afraid if it will. Was It a Werewolf? By Juliet. I'm from Colorado Springs, Colorado. This story happened to me when I was about 13 years old, and I'm now 36, so 23 years ago. One evening, my brother, his friend, and I decided to drive up to this area that has a cool overlook of the city. It's right next to a church, and the area is more developed now, but back then the area to the east of the church was foothills with one house built there about a half-mile east of the church. The church itself overlooks the city and the Rocky Mountains. Below it is a neighborhood. To the immediate south, north, and west of the church are also neighborhoods, no more than a quarter of a mile away in each direction, except the east. The overlook is looking to the southwest. This area is somewhere we'd gone before with friends because below the overlook to the southwest before the neighborhood begins is an area that's very shrubby and rocky. We'd go explore down there and hang out in this cave-type area, being the bored teenagers that we were. So, on this night, my brother, his girlfriend, and I decided to just go park up there and enjoy the view and hang out. We'd only been there a few minutes, and I decided to get out and smoke a cigarette. When I got out, I walked to the back of my brother's car, and then turned back toward the view. Something caught my eye to the right of my brother's car. It was about 10 or 20 feet from his car and moving towards us. It looked like a huge black dog, blacker than the night because I could still see its outline. It was like the size of a wolf, but much thicker. I got scared because it was only about 25 feet away from me, and I took a lighter out of my pocket and started to flick it, thinking maybe I'd scare it. This all took place in about 20 seconds. Then, as this thing was moving or walking towards us, it morphed into a human shape. I was standing there scared like, what the hell is that? That's when I heard a voice behind me. Hey, you're not allowed to be up here. You need to leave. 2 men from that church were walking over. I guess they had problems with people hanging out up there, but anyway, the thing wasn't there when I looked back. I got in my brother's car and we left. On another time we were hanging out up in that area near the lookout down in the shrubs, my best friend saw something. We were playing hide and seek at night right up there with about 5 or 7 of us, and we were walking through a bunch of scrub oak, and my best friend who was in front of me just froze. She said that standing in front of her was what she could only describe as a werewolf. She always saw things. I rarely saw them, but felt them more so. I always wondered if what she saw and what happened to me were somehow connected. The Parking Lot Thing by Beverly. I live in Dallas, Texas, where I'm an attorney. Around February of the year 1998, I was in a business meeting held in an office building in downtown Dallas, and it wasn't an old building, it was one of those mirrored glass skyscrapers. Anyway, the meeting was dismissed around 10:30 that evening, but a few people from our firm stayed around to discuss the outcome. Around 11 o'clock, 2 of them left, leaving me alone with one of my closest friends, Brent. We chatted a little longer, for maybe another 15 minutes before exiting the room. He had parked in a pay-and-park lot across the street, and I had parked in the parking garage adjacent to this building. After we said our goodbyes, he got in an elevator and I looked for directions on making my way back to the parking garage. I was a little surprised at the seeming lack of security, as there were no guards or officers present that I could see, save for the lobby, at which there were several security guards at the front doors. I ended up having to go down to the lobby. I believe we had been on the 37th floor for the meeting, and I found out how to exit to the parking garage. I was told I had to get back into the elevator and go to the 8th floor, turn the corner, go down a hall until I reached the exit doors, and that should take me to the parking ramp. I thanked them and got in the elevator, and around 10 minutes later I was relieved to have the parking garage spanning before me. Or so I thought. Fantastic. A huge empty parking garage, 8 stories up where absolutely no one would hear me if I had to scream. I was also surprised to find it almost completely filled with cars. At such a late hour, however, I noticed there seemed to be a lot of activity in one of the surrounding buildings and guessed maybe the cars belonged to the guests over there. I didn't remember exactly where I parked, but I knew it was at least several rows back, so I started walking past the cars and walked maybe 5 or so rows when I finally spotted mine. I was no more than 40 feet away from it when, in the row of cars behind mine, something ran extremely fast and then disappeared behind other cars. Let me describe this something, as childish as it may sound. It looked basically like Uncle Fester from the television show The Addams Family if he were painted completely black and scurried around on all fours. I am 99.9% sure whatever it was not human, although I can't give a logical explanation for what it was. While it was scurrying by, it gave a creepy laugh of some sort, and when I first saw it, I thought I had to be imagining things. But I kept watching and watching, and I was still seeing it, and to this very day I am positive I saw what I saw. I watched it run down the aisle behind the cars for about 5 seconds, then I turned and started running back towards the doors. I was most scared because I didn't know where it had gone, and I couldn't hear anything except my heart beating in my ears. I can say I have never been so scared in my life, and I seriously doubt I ever will be. I jumped down the elevator while the doors were still opening, pressed the door close button, and went back to the lobby. I called Brent on his car phone while walking to the front desk and basically begged him to come back and take me home. He could tell I was pretty frantic because of my voice and was back at the building within 10 minutes. I'm generally a pretty calm person. He asked me what was wrong several times in the car, but every time I thought back, it pictured in my mind and I felt like I was going to vomit or faint. About an hour later, we were still at my house, and I was finally able to give him a little gist of what had happened. As we are both rigid, conservative attorneys, the whole situation was a little difficult for him to believe, as I'm sure it would have been for me if the situation would have been reversed. Inside the Stadium, submitted by Tai Yuk. About 10 years ago, a friend we met here in Asia had been visiting and living in Indonesia. He has a very different constitution than the average man and talks in a very matter-of-fact kind of way. He told us all kinds of amazing stories about life in Indonesia, and one in particular about a place where he had seen reptilian beings on more than one occasion. The place where they were seen was at a nightclub in Jakarta called the Stadium, which may seem ludicrous until you understand what kind of place it was. It was a place of low vibration where people pursue their carnal lusts. Women are sold into prostitution, and ecstasy was sold in the open on silver trays by the staff. The place was done in a reptilian motif with all kinds of Illuminati symbolism, such as the eternal flame, like the one the Statue of Liberty holds in New York Harbor, or the Monas Tower in Jakarta. The railing of the different levels that overlooked the dance floor was all cobra heads with their hoods spread, and a huge winged dragon suspended over the stage and sound system with a humanoid figure sitting mounted on its neck. That figure was holding a scepter. We kind of agreed that it was Isis. On a lower level there was a bar and a stage. On the stage was a large sculpture of a man that looked like the top half of the Oscar award, muscular but with its hands chained together at the wrists as to suggest humanity enslaved. The place was huge and a lot of money was put into it. Anyway, our friend invited us to visit him in Jakarta, and that we could go and try to see the reptilians if we wished, but there were no guarantees we would see them. They don't always show themselves, or certain conditions must align in order for them to be seen. Our friend said that they were only visible 2 or 3 times out of every 10 times he visited. Yeah, he was a real party hound, and he would go into this place and stay there until Monday morning, thinking it was Sunday, until his employer would call and ask him why he wasn't at work. One of the conditions to see these reptilian beings was that you had to take ecstasy. And I know a lot of people hearing this will say, they were high on drugs. It was all a drug-induced hallucination, case closed. I wish it were that simple. Another way to view it is that the brain is a biological computer that can see and decode a very small range of visible light, and ecstasy brings the brain down to a lower vibration where these things are visible. However, when you figure in the reptilian factor, it explains a lot of things. Like, why does royalty only marry royalty? Why are there dungeons with torture devices under castles? Thousands of people vanish every year around the world. Where do they go? So we went to the stadium on a Saturday night, and the place was in full swing, blaring loud music, and crowds were dancing to the loud pulse of the rave-style tunes. We all took a pill of ecstasy and began drinking like fish, as the alcohol really didn't seem to faze us. I think there was methamphetamine in there as well. I don't enjoy these damn pills at all, but in order to view these creatures it must be done, and as I said, our host has a different constitution. There were 3 in our group, and we would wander around drinking beer and exploring the different levels of the club going our own way, and then meet up with each other again here and there at random. One of our party had made friends with a Canadian guy who was also on E, and would also be in for the surprise of his life. Several hours passed uneventfully, and I had bumped into our host again, and we were hanging out when the other guy in our party came up to us with a frantic, disconcerted aura about him, and his mouth dropped open in astonishment, to which our host said, "You saw him, didn't you?" The guy just nodded in agreement because he was so stunned he couldn't speak. Our host directed us to the cobra motif railing that overlooked the huge dance floor. We were up on the 3rd floor and had a view of the entire floor that was very crowded, and our host said, "Don't tell us where they are. We will point them out, and you will concur if we are right." There were 2 by the DJ booth and 1 out in the crowd, a total of 3. You couldn't see them right off. It depended on the lighting. When they were in the stray ambient light, they appeared human, but as they moved out of the light into shadow, they would shapeshift. Their arms would become very long, and they were about 7 feet tall. When they drifted back into the light, they would appear human again. I don't know how to explain it really, but it's mind-blowing to say the least to encounter pure evil and mass manipulators of humanity that have caused unspeakable horror and suffering throughout the ages. Terror is their candy. They get excited around it, like a python in a cage with a rabbit. It shook our one friend up quite a bit, as he did not believe in anything paranormal, and really shook his belief system so bad that shortly afterwards he just got on a plane and went back to Canada. I mean, with only the shirt on his back. He abandoned everything in his apartment and went back to his mother's house. It shook him up pretty bad, to say the least. I was shook up too, but not near as bad as him because I knew such things existed. I've had my own paranormal experiences, but to the unbeliever it can cause a great shock because everything they thought was true is nonsense now. The "this can't be happening" is the door to fear. However, he did fully recover and has returned to Asia. Now, I can tell my paranormal stories and theories are not to be scoffed at or be dismissed without examination. I've heard the stadium has since closed down. It wasn't really smiled upon because of the drugs and depravity that goes on there, and God knows what else. But I always suspected horrible things went on in that basement, such as human sacrifice and or torture, knowing the nature of reptilians. The stadium was closed down after some rich kid, lit on drugs and drunk on alcohol, sped down a street one morning and plowed into a crowd of vendors, killing about 8 people. That's okay, though. We don't miss that place at all. And last I heard, the reptilians weren't showing themselves for whatever reason. These beings are a scourge on humanity and have kept us ignorant in order to exploit us. They are highly intelligent and master manipulators, and know the best way to keep slaves is to keep them thinking they are free and in control, and this eliminates the threat of revolt. The reptilians are everywhere, in education, science, and, oh yes, religion. Thanks for listening, gang. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I'll be back with more scares next week. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And you can also leave a comment down below. I respond to everything. I love the conversation. If you've got a story you'd like to hear on this channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And if you feel so inclined, throw me a tip in my Patreon at my Patreon page. The link is in the description below, along with all of my social media outlets. I hope to see you there as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.